to getting us all here. How many people were here yesterday? All right, half of you. Those of you who weren't, you missed out on some really great conversations that really kind of outline the broad themes around policing of race and gender and sexuality and disability and geographies and borders, and then also around resistance across genders, communities, and nations, focusing on policing and law enforcement and state violence, and then what we also just talked about, carceral spaces generally. Which are spaces focused on policing and punishment, for those of you like me who recently learned what carceral feminism and carceral spaces mean. And also just really questioning like the things that we normally think of, like policy or legal remedies, or believing that this moment will be saved by lawsuits in the ACLU, and really kind of thinking actually that we need to divest from that and actually building alternative systems of care and accountability and safety. So that's where we were yesterday. Today we're going to take a deeper dive into many of these themes through these three amazing panels that Lisa was talking about, and this closing resistance roundtable that is going to bring together folks who are really on the front lines of really figuring out how we're going to move past sort of this, or figure out how to increase violence, or increase safety from all forms of violence for women, trans, and gender non-conforming people of color, and many of whom have been doing it for a really long time from many different perspectives. So if you were here for last night's resistance or opening roundtable, tell the folks who are here today that they want to stick around for the closing roundtable. So our first panel today is taking a deeper dive around immigration issues and immigration enforcement. I think that in the past couple of years, there's been a lot more attention, unprecedented attention to police violence against Black women and women of color, and yet in this moment of intensifying immigration enforcement, we are not paying as much attention or centering our analysis around how that's playing out literally on the bodies of immigrant women, trans, and gender non-conforming people at the border, often in the form of rape and physical violence at the border by Border Patrol, but also by law enforcement officers in the interior who engaged in profiling and violence against immigrant people and immigrant women and trans and gender non-conforming people in ways that are very specific to their experience. Some of you may have seen literally the other day a mother in Southern California being just literally ripped off the street from her 3 children into a van. That's a story that's happening every day, but not one that is at the center of our debates around immigration enforcement right now. So with that, I would like to invite our panel moderator, Leti, who's also the director of the Center for Race and Gender here at Berkeley, to introduce the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see you here today. Our first speaker is going to be Marta Escobar, who is a professor at Cal State University Northridge, and also the author of Captivity Beyond Prisons, Criminalization Experiences of Latina Immigrants. Our second speaker will be Angie Junck, who's a supervising attorney at the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, where she helps coordinate the Defending Immigrants Project and also the Immigrant Justice Network. Our third speaker will be Saira Hussain, who is an attorney at the, I want to say Asian Law Caucus, at Advancing Justice, what is it? I'm sorry.
Asian Law Caucus is fine.
At the Asian Law Caucus. This is what happens when organizations rebrand themselves and you can never remember what their new name is. Okay, so Advancing Justice - the Asian Law Caucus, where she works on questions of criminal justice reform and specifically focused on its entanglement with immigration. And then our fourth and final speaker is Wang, who's a professor at the University of Washington at Bothell, and she's somebody who's been doing a ton of work looking at questions of feminist anti-violence organizing in the context specifically around immigration law policing.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you to all the organizers who put this amazing event together. These are folks whose work I've been following for a very, very long time, and it's just an honor to be here and have this conversation with folks. And thank you for the organizers and for the center for having us here and providing this space for us. So in my work, I look at the intersection of immigration enforcement and carcerality in relationship to Latina migrants and their criminalization. And for me, this work is very, very personal. I come from an immigrant background. My parents were undocumented at one point. So my family, I continue to have family members that are undocumented, folks that have been deported after being marked criminal aliens, and then facing additional violence once, in this case, in our case, once they return to Mexico, right? So this is very personal for me. And so I'm really, I think for those of us that are invested in social justice, right, we want to really understand what's at stake and really what are the root causes of some of these problems, because we want real change, right? And so for me, that forced me to really think about the frameworks that we use to advocate for change. Coming from an immigrant background, I grew up with the immigrant rights movement. 1994, for those of you from California or that remember that time, I always date myself with my students, right? When I bring them 1994, some of them were not even born yet. I was 14 years old at the time, and I was, we organized around Proposition 187, which was an anti-immigrant policy here in California. It was passed. It was eventually declared unconstitutional. But anyway, at that time, I was one of the students that walked out in protest of Proposition 187. I grew up with the immigrant rights movement since then, and growing up within that community, a constant message that has been narrated and has dominated a lot of the immigrant rights mobilization has been this idea of immigrants are not criminals. Immigrants are hard workers. And so as an undergraduate, I was a first-year student, 1998, at UC Riverside. And I immediately got involved with Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano Aztlán, and I immediately got involved in organizing. And that December of 1998, Taisha Miller, a young black woman in Riverside, she had fallen asleep and was unconscious in her car, this young black woman, just 1 year older than I was at that time. Her family called the police to check in on her. She was unresponsive, and what ended up happening in her case is that she appeared to move, and so once she moved, they started shooting into the car, and they killed her, shooting her 12 times from behind the car. And so, for me, that moment was really important, my own thinking about state violence. I already had an antagonistic relationship to the state. Like I said, growing up with folks that are undocumented, and growing up with folks that are, violated by the police every so often, you just develop that relationship with the state where you know they're not there to protect you. But Taisha Miller's death was really important for my own politicization, to understand the role of the police and what it's there to do to our communities. And so hearing the immigrant rights movement latch on to this notion that we are hard workers, we are not criminals, right, got me to thinking that some of us are marked as criminal, right? That it's up to the state to define whatever crime is. And in Taisha Miller's case, they said that they believed that she had a gun, that she was reaching for a gun, and that merited her death, that her death was justified in that way. So in my own work and looking at the criminalization of Latina migrants, what I have made it a point is to look at the relationship between Black folks and Latino communities and provide this comparative and relational analysis. And what that has gotten me to think about is about the origins of criminalization in the United States, especially in relationship to slavery, and the development of the prison system in the United States in relationship to Black folks, enslaved Black folks, and how that is fundamental to the experiences of Latina migrants. So in terms of slavery, non-white bodies being brought into the nation as non-citizens to labor for a white nation to accumulate wealth, and understanding how that has been fundamental to shaping migration patterns for folks, so that now majority non-white folks are brought in to labor for the nation to create wealth, right? So making those connections, also looking at the centrality of women in that relationship. So in the case of Black women, their motherhood denied in terms of slavery, looking at those historical connections, being forced to have children in order to create wealth for white folks, for white society, for white life to prosper, right? And denied social motherhood, not because their children inherited the status of the mother, so their children would be enslaved and sold off at the master's whim, right? Whenever the master decided it was time. And so looking at the centrality of women's reproduction and how women's bodies have been targeted historically in these processes. So with Latina, and then later on in the 1960s, Black women's bodies also targeted once again in this case by the state for intervention by the state, where it is when women of color, especially Black women, are, because of the civil rights movement and various social movements, are about to receive some level of protection by the state, right? When we open up the welfare state to communities of color, that's precisely the moment when welfare gets criminalized, and this merging of criminality and dependency come together against the bodies of Black women, against the families of Black women, that we start seeing these ideas of the welfare queen, for example, later on the crack mother, the criminalization of these women and their bodies that have merged dependency and criminality, then get merged onto Latina women in the 80s and 90s, right? So similar rhetoric, similar discourse that gets developed in relationship to Black women that gets mapped onto Latina women in the 80s and 90s. And so for me, this notion in terms of immigrant rights, right, discourse, that immigrants are not criminals, immigrants are hard workers. In the United States, criminality developed, in my work, the way that I analyze it, criminality developed in relationship to Black folks, ideas about criminality. And so if that's the case, and if women's bodies have been central to organizing those relationships, what that means then is that when we see similar discourse deployed against immigrant women in the 80s and the 90s, that these women are coming in to take our resources, to have children, to feed off the state, right? And that their children are growing up to be criminals, to be to also benefit from the state, right? Not wanting to work. We need to understand though that comparative relational. We need to provide that comparative and relational analysis in order to really understand what's happening. And so when immigrant rights advocates say immigrants are not criminals, what we're really saying is that immigrants are not going to be another Black problem, right? The valuing of some is always relational and violent. The valuing of some is always in relationship to somebody that's other. So by saying immigrants are not criminals, well, who is, right? Immigrants are hard workers, well, who's lazy? And in the United States, that history has been in relationship, especially to Black folks and especially to Black women. So for me, I always ask my students to be radical, and so to look at the root causes of social problems. And if we are serious about immigrant justice, then we need to connect our histories and our experiences in relationship to other folks, especially to the criminalization that Black communities and especially Black women have faced, in order to really create some type of transformative change to build a more livable world where we can thrive and more communities can be well, right? And so I think a big part of my work is trying to move immigrant rights frameworks away from this politics of deservingness and politics of respectability, right? And toward abolition. This isn't gonna work right? Us trying to expand the good immigrant category, including the dreamer movement. And I'm very mindful that there might be dreamers in the room, right? But we need to push them because we always have to ask, when we're asking for belonging of some through that narrative of deservingness, it's always in relationship to somebody that's going to pay a price. And we have to ask what price is being asked for us and who's going to pay that price. We're always going to, if we engage in those politics, we're always going to end up enforcing some type of violence against some bodies. And I think an abolitionist framework is a lot more productive for us. What does it mean to build a world where somebody's life is not contingent on somebody else's death and on freedom? And that's a lot more productive. So that's where I'm at in terms of the conversation in terms of abolition and in terms of immigrant rights. We have to understand our history that's related to each other and make those connections to build coalitions that are going to be productive to bring about change and really build the world that we want to live in.
Hi, my name is Angie. I'm with the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. And I've been working at this intersection called criminalization since the early 2000s. And doing this work, I come from an immigrant family. I was a child of Prop 187 through high school, and then I got involved in criminal, legal work through doing some death row cases. And I had no idea of the intersection of systems until I worked with a group called Free Battered Women. It's a project of the California Coalition for Women Prisoners. There are going to be people here that are speaking from that coalition today. And that group had really been working with incarcerated survivors of domestic violence, visiting them in prison, and really trying to tell their stories and to secure their freedom from unjust penalties that they served because they weren't able to tell their stories in court. And through that process, we met many women, and one of the women that I was able to meet was Maria, and she was one of only a handful of people that actually got parole from former Governor Gray Davis, who wasn't giving parole to anyone. And so people were very ecstatic that we could secure such a win, but we had no idea what was coming because as soon as that win was secured, we found out that she was facing mandatory deportation in the United States, and no one saw that. And that is what triggered what I saw, really one of the first deportation defense campaigns that I've ever seen. There's a lot of them happening now, but this was a campaign led by her family to mobilize, organize, and activate the media and elected officials at that time to tell the story of a woman that had been locked up 25 years to life, who was basically trafficked and abused, but ended up helping to kill, her abuser. And it was a sad time at one point because there was another woman that was faced deportation at the same time, and she wasn't able to fight and win that campaign. But Maria's case got a lot of media attention, and she was able to win. But it taught me a lot about the power of organizing, of family, of community, and making what most people would say even today an impossibility a possibility. Of getting someone out who was in a life sentence in state prison, the bad immigrants to a lot of people saying, you should never be able to protect someone that has actually killed another life. Mm-hmm. And so since that time, I've been working at this intersection with my organization, Immigrant Legal Resource Center, as well as a network called the Immigrant Justice Network with partners in New York, Boston, and DC, to really work towards ending these unjust penalties of immigrants with criminal convictions and looking at this broader, expanding narrative of the criminalization of immigrants that has evolved over time. And so I just want to say something about this area of crimmigration that I think a lot of people hear about, but they don't know, what exactly does this mean? What is it actually doing? And I see it essentially as this intertwining of a criminal, legal, and an immigration system to really create, maintain, and perpetuate an unequal relationship between immigrant communities of color and dominant society. So many of you probably know of the storylines about looking at mass incarceration as kind of the modern day tool without ever having to explicitly use race, but knowing that it's specifically targeted communities of color, specifically Black people, to always keep them in a lower position of power. And we see that mass deportation is another tool to do the same thing. And what it basically allows our society to do is to define who does and who does not belong, and who is American and who is not American. And so that's the narrative that's playing out today. I think that Martha alludes to is that, you know, certain immigrants, they're not American. They don't belong here. And it's easier to label people based on individual behaviors and say you're a criminal to exclude you than to look at the root causes of racism that underlies our system. And so in terms of like what this looks like in practice, it basically, the way that the immigration system has relied on mass incarceration to propel a massive criminal justice system into the dominant role of detection, arrest, prosecution, labeling, and the removal of millions of immigrants, especially over the last decade. And once you have an arrest or conviction, it becomes very easy to say, well, you should be removed, you deserve that outcome. And we know that this has disproportionate outcomes, particularly on Black immigrants, and then some Latino immigrants as well, because they're the ones that are subject to police violence. In terms of just the issues that we see with women, as Andrea had mentioned, we don't really see this narrative as much. I mean, I think there's stories that are being told about women and deportation, but there's so many different levels of it that is not being told. I mean, the first one is just the fact that we have a lot of victims of violence. Like I talked about Maria's case, where she is both a domestic violence victim herself, but she is caught in the criminal legal system. There's disproportionate penalties that she faces, but then yet there's this double harsh punishment at the end where they're deported and they're made to disappear. There's another kind of issue that's been arising over the past few years. We have an unprecedented migration of people from Central America due to severe violence, and many, I've worked in this intersection for about 10 years, and it mostly had been young males from 16 to 17 years old that were coming, and over the last few years, it had been an unprecedented number of young women who have been coming to escape violence, rape, gang recruitment in their home countries. And many of them have come to the United States, many of them pregnant or with very small children. And those are the people that have actually been subject to what we are seeing, a new resurgence of family immigration detention, where they don't just detain individuals, they detain family units. Mothers with children in locked up cells for civil immigration with no date in sight for them to be able to be released, because they don't want them to be in our society and they feel like they don't have claims to be here, they don't belong. And then I think the final thing to talk about, and we really don't even talk about this as much in the immigrant rights movement, we're so focused on the person being deported, we don't talk about where the brunt of deportation and who holds those, the harm and the trauma from that. And there's so many communities. We work a lot in this, like with Saira, the Southeast Asian community. There's a lot of Southeast Asians that have been deported, but who's been left behind? A lot of the women raising children alone with family. It's so many other family members. I work a lot in the criminal justice system, where I'm working with defenders to defend someone against domestic violence, but working with the victim as well, saying, look, I don't want deportation as an outcome in this, but the district attorneys don't really care because of what the outcomes are going to be. Even if this someone had actually come forward and said, I want, police protection, at the end of the day, what we're looking at is a split apart family, economic, emotional burdens that happen, and we've seen the products of what happens with some of those children too, that then themselves become victims of the system themselves and enter into the delinquency system. So we kind of see the cycle continue, and it's so important for us to talk about that impact of like a lot of the people that have been left behind for deportation. I'll finally just say is like, what are we doing instead of like what the problem is, what are we doing to address kind of these pillars of oppression in both the short, medium, and long term. One of the things we're doing is a very typical vehicle is around policy advocacy. And we are really, at our organization, are trying to address some of these drivers of inequality to make sure that they don't leave immigrants behind. If we're looking at a mass deportation problem that is rooted in mass incarceration, we cannot look at small fixes. We need to look at more holistic fixes, and we need to build power with partners that are actually moving these agendas. So the way that this looks like is, you may have heard of this concept of sanctuary, right? Of like, how do we do sanctuary cities? And a lot of the focus has been on like, how do we protect immigrants in sanctuary cities? And that's kind of where the political will is. But our work is to really connect the dots of the fact that sanctuary means for all vulnerable communities, and where can we link these issues of police violence and deportation together. And so those are the things that we're looking at the local level to curb police violence, police bias, surveillance, decriminalization of crimes, things such as bail reform. You should be able to get out, not because you can't afford to pay, but because you deserve to be, free. DA accountability, there's a whole campaign around the abuse of prosecutors to prosecute people, ensuring effective representation of people every day that show up into court. And so these are the ways in which we can find commonalities working together. At the state level, moving state reforms as well. We're very lucky to have a progressive legislature that has been moving criminal justice reforms in a really great way, but we're also capitalizing on the fact that we can talk about the impact on immigrants. And so there have been some really innovative reforms. One example is around gang databases, where Cal gang databases are somewhat on hold, and we're not going to share information with the federal government until there is a full review of those systems and accountability. There's post-conviction vehicles in which we're bridging claims for people of innocence, but also challenging unconstitutional convictions for immigrants, and really moving in multi-issue intersectional alliances to move and show that we're standing for each other in these things. In terms of the long term, I think that Martha kind of alluded to is like, how do we actually make this a reality of building between these movements? And I think that that has been the most challenging thing. I think that we can say this all we want, but we actually have to put the work in. And even in somewhere like California, which is very diverse, I think groups tend to still work in silos. I think a lot of the work that happens is transactional. It is showing up for a rally or doing petitions. And so there have been some examples of really deep bridge building alliances, and I think that they've been really great opportunities for kind of taking a step back and looking at the root causes of what we're looking at. For someone that's been doing this for 15 years, I could keep tweaking little immigration fixes in a broken criminal legal system, but then we're still going to have another problem in 6 months. So we're not addressing those, and we're not really building power, right? I mean, it's not just about one campaign, it's about the long-term fight. And so I think there's been some really innovative coalition building that hasn't been about an immigration coalition, it hasn't been about a criminal justice coalition, some of it has been around racial justice. It's about defining not only what we don't want, but what we do want. And when we start talking about that and forcing people to have that discussion, we start to see a lot of bridges about and commonalities between a lot of communities about what safety really means for us, that we want jobs, we want healthcare. It's not only about law enforcement all the time. And then I think the final thing that I would just say, and to echo what Martha said, is just around matters. Our language absolutely matters, and unfortunately, even in places where there's good intent, we continue to perpetuate this paradigm that is always excluding another. And the reality is the immigrant rights movement is an anti-Black movement at this point in time, and there is not that acknowledgement of how we look at this, and we have a lot more to do in acknowledging those other spaces of how we're impacting that discussion around criminalization and looking at immigrant rights as kind of the forefront of criminalization. So I think that there's things that we can be doing to learn from the movement to decarcerate, from the Black Lives Matter as well. And so those are things that I think it's for not only us, for us to push, but to sit back and learn and listen and to find new strategies to look at this beyond just immigration reform, because we know just if we get citizenship, behind citizenship lies so many issues that we see with other communities. So thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Saira. I'm with the Asian Law Caucus, and I'm also an organizer with Survived and Punished. You can read more about Survived and Punished in your guides, and there's going to be several other speakers who will be speaking from our organization as well. So a lot of my work revolves around disentangling local law enforcement from immigration. I work pretty closely with Angie and her organization. And then the other facet of the work that we do is around police misconduct cases, especially involving immigrants. So we're especially interested in the intersection of language access, domestic violence, and immigration. So back in 2007, our organization helped draft the San Francisco Police Department's general order around language access. What we were seeing on the ground in the community was victims of domestic violence calling the police or having the police call on them by their abuser, and then basically having no way of communicating with the police, and ultimately they would either be arrested or nothing would be done in their situations. And so we helped draft this policy, but what we've recognized is that it's not really being implemented. Basically, if you have the ability to speak any English whatsoever, that's often seen as sufficient for the police department. Or if the abuser is actually a fluent English speaker, oftentimes what will happen is they will just take the abuser's word, and oftentimes the abuser will use it to manipulate the police system. And so ultimately, the survivor is often the one who's left behind trying to figure out the, whatever criminal charges they're facing, because they're often arrested instead. And we see this often in Violence Against Women Act cases, arrests for domestic violence. We just recently settled a case involving a woman in San Francisco who was attacked by her abuser, and then the abuser ended up going to the police and claiming that he was attacked instead. And she wasn't provided an interpreter. She was told, you speak and we'll understand you. And in fact, they didn't understand her. And they not only didn't allow her the opportunity to tell her story, but they actually discounted her 5-year-old child who witnessed the attack. And so ultimately she was arrested and separated from her children for a month. Because there was first a temporary restraining order in place, and then after that, her abuser just kept telling her that he would call the police on her if she returned to the house. And of course, she was very afraid to return because of her encounter with law enforcement. So this whole issue of language access and domestic violence, it really has this important interplay when we're considering about how police misconduct affects immigrant women in particular, and many immigrant women, as we know, and we've seen in the statistics, rates of sexual assault and rape have not been reported to police. They've actually decreased in the past couple of years, and it's because of the fear, oftentimes when it comes to immigration status and going to law enforcement. And also just, generally, many communities of color have really negative experiences with law enforcement, and they do not feel like that is an avenue for them. And so oftentimes what we're seeing is like the perpetuation of this denial of language access sort of just creates another barrier for many survivors to be able to extricate themselves from these situations. I want to shift into talking a little bit about immigration enforcement and the impact on Asian women, and especially criminalized Asian women. So the Asian population in jails or in prisons is actually it's much less than the actual population in regular society. But when you look at the rates of Southeast Asians and Pacific Islanders in prison, it's actually very high. So the Asian prisoner population here in California has nearly quadrupled in the last 25 years, and primarily, like I mentioned, among Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander populations. And then the unique thing that they often face is they have this, many of them have sort of a double experience. First is the refugee experience in coming to the United States, oftentimes being born in refugee camps, maybe never having even set foot into their country of origin. and then coming to the United States, going through the traumatic experience of trying to adjust with very, very few resources, and then when incarcerated, they also face the double punishment of deportation. So there's not been too much research done about women and in prison, but there is an ACLU study that has estimated that in some women's prisons, up to 90% of women prisoners are survivors of sexual or domestic violence. And when we've spoken with some of our clients, one of them said, I've never met anybody who was a survivor of violence in California state prisons. And what we see is when Asian women are criminalized, oftentimes there's two things that we see. We see the refugee experience really reflect and resonate, and the trauma of that, never having dealt with that experience, really coming, often causing the criminalization in the first place. The second thing that we see is often these really criminalized tropes coming about, particularly when it pertains to Asian women. And we often see that when Asian women do not conform to the societal standard of being submissive and docile, the criminalization can often be heightened. So I'm going to tell you about a couple of clients that we worked with, and you can kind of see these two themes running through their stories. The first is our client Mia Norn. She was born in a Thai refugee camp and moved to the US at the age of 5. She had a really unstable home environment because her stepfather was abusive to her mother, and in turn her mother abused her. And so when she was a teenager, she was looking for basically affection, some form of affection, and she entered into a dangerous relationship with a much older man. She was 16 and he was 34. And he began to immediately control her and her movements and the things that she did. And then when she was 18, he actually killed her boss in front of her in a fit of jealousy. He then threatened her life and basically subjected her to horrific violence and abuse for the next 3 years. He also threatened to kill her family, and so she didn't ever tell anybody about the murder. And finally, at the age of 21, she went to the police and she just said, I just want the police to stop, and she told them everything. When she did reveal to them that her abuser had murdered her boss, she was tried and convicted for first-degree murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Once again, the idea of this trope of culpability, the judge in the case said, in weighing the culpability here, I think Ms. Norn has more culpability than her abuser because she let this mad dog off the leash, right? She appealed her case because under California's habeas law, if the evidence of battered woman syndrome is not presented at the first trial, then you can either try to appeal it or get a new trial. And in her case, she was resentenced to 15 to life. In January 2017, she was granted parole by the governor. And she was released in May. And then immediately, she was picked up by immigration. And she spent the next 4 months in immigration detention, or 5 months in immigration detention. And we were able to get her out on bond, a bond that no longer exists because the Supreme Court struck it down last week. And so she's fighting her immigration case now. So in her particular experience, she really sees the refugee experience as being one of the things that really caused her unstable home environment, right? That caused her to seek affection from this unhealthy relationship. Oftentimes in Southeast Asian cultures, once people migrate to the U.S., oftentimes the trauma is so deep that they don't talk about it. And in her particular situation, she often talks about how the trauma causes more domestic violence because people aren't figuring out other ways to talk about it or deal with it, and so oftentimes it comes out in the home. The other thing here was, once again, the tropes around Asian women, how she was seen as more culpable because she let the mad dog off the leash. She was, in the media, characterized as a seductress, that she was somebody who sort of caused this murder to happen, that she pushed it along, and that really wasn't the case at all. And really, the domestic violence and the horrific abuse that she suffered was really shoved under the rug and never brought up in the popular media. The second case I'm going to talk about is around Nanhee Jo, and she herself is going to be here to talk to you, so I don't want to give away too much of her story. But she's an undocumented Korean woman who entered into a relationship with an Army veteran suffering PTSD. And he became abusive, and she called the police multiple times, and no reports were taken down. In fact, during one such call, the police basically said, the police officer said, I have a wife too, I know how it gets, like just walk it off. So once again, we see this sort of issue with language access, domestic violence, policing that comes up again. She was informed by the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services that she had overstayed her visa and that she had to leave, and she was in this relationship that was violent. And so she decided to leave the country, and she took her child with her in 2009. They had a child together. When she returned in 2015, she was granted a visa waiver by USCIS, and then when she came back into the country, she was immediately arrested by Customs and Border Protection. And then we found out that the waiver was given in the hopes of luring her back to the United States. So it was like a form of the state trying to trap her, and they basically laid this trap for her as soon as she came back. She was actually charged with child abduction for leaving a domestic violence relationship with her child. And she ended up going through 2 trials. She was convicted of misdemeanor child abduction. And then immediately after she was released, she was sentenced to time served, ICE immediately picked her up and took her into their custody. And this entire time, her child was now with her abuser, was in the custody of her abuser. Some of the things that we saw in her situation were a lot of these tropes taking place at trial. So this trial took place in 2015. So it wasn't that long ago. And it was in Yolo County, just up north. But during the trial, the DA actually called her a tiger mom. There was a real downplaying of domestic violence. While they recognized that there had been instances of domestic violence, the DA said this was not a domestic violence relationship. There may have been incidents of violence that took place. And we saw that not just within the courtroom, but also from the newspapers that reported the story. And then one of the newspapers actually had this headline where they didn't paint it as domestic violence. They called it a cross-cultural love story gone wrong. So a lot of these tropes, as we see, really do a lot to downplay the incidence of domestic violence and put a lot of culpability on the women in particular, and especially when there's not a display of hyper competency, essentially, where it's like, well, they should have known what to do, putting them at an extreme higher standard in comparison to the abuser. The last thing I want to end on, and thank you, Elisa, for a quick nugget about this before I came up here. She asked, are you going to talk about Islamophobia? And I was like, why didn't I think about that? So I think we see Islamophobia also play out in situations of domestic violence, especially involving Middle Eastern and Muslim women. So the one case that I'm actually following really closely is around the Pulse nightclub shooting, right, that took place in Orlando. Some of you may know this, but the shooter's wife is being charged with material support to foreign terrorist organization. In her case, it is well documented that she was a victim of domestic violence, that her husband was severely abusive to her. But in the charges that she's facing, the authorities are saying that she knew about the plan beforehand and she didn't stop him, right? So once again, this whole idea of culpability, where they're not saying that she was involved in any of it, but they're saying that she didn't stop him, right? And I think that in a lot of these cases involving these sort of like large-scale, what we call terror attacks, and I think there's a lot of talk right now, especially given what happened in Austin and what's being labeled terrorism, and if that's even a useful label at all. But in these situations, often what we see is that when somebody is believed to to be a terrorist, particularly of Middle Eastern origin or Muslim origin, oftentimes what we see is once they've either been captured or killed or whatever it is, the ranks start closing in around the families a lot of the time. And a lot of the people that you see then face criminalization in the next stage, and that's severely underreported, is the women. Like oftentimes the women partners. And the thing is, we know that many of these mass killers, this is not their first act of violence. They have previous convictions for domestic violence, and they've been well documented to be domestic violence abusers in their homes, oftentimes ignored by police. And so what we see is that even though the woman oftentimes is the victim, they then face the criminalization in sort of the next stage as the FBI is trying to sort of close the ranks around the family and try to find culpability that way.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's great to see everyone here. I want to thank Andrea and Melissa for organizing and Leti for facilitating. And I'm just really thankful and grateful to be on this panel with folks. So I'm going to talk a bit, I think, just sort of building off of what everyone has said, and to start and sort of think about the immigration system as actually not a broken system. And this is something Angie raised a bit in her talk, because what I'm hearing now and a lot of sort of longer trajectories around immigration, particularly from white liberals, is this idea that the immigration system is broken and we just need to create these fixes for it. But in many ways, the immigration system is continuing and refining and improving and expanding on what it was originally designed to do, which is to better and create a settler colonial state. If we were to think of immigration in that way, all of these small sort of fixes, as well as forms of legal protections, don't fall outside of our ideas of violence, right? They shouldn't be seen as exceptions to violence. They shouldn't be seen as small moments when the immigration system is working, but rather they also are a form of violence in the overall system of immigration, its militarization as well as its criminalization, and well as its legacy within settler colonialism. And so that's sort of what I always want to try to push myself to think about, which is very difficult to do when sort of the general narrative around immigration, which Martha brought up, is always within this good-bad immigrant, which is within the paradigm of this good-bad citizen as well. So my work is around looking at the violence of legal protection, and instead of sort of centering legal protection as something that's exceptional outside the violence of the law, moments when things are working, but to actually think about and to talk about how legal protection and the violence of that protection serves the larger frame of the immigration system itself, and how immigration law then intersects with the ways we think about gender and sexual violence, which oftentimes is always just seen within these like smaller moments, either when we see extreme forms of failure, but to me it's also violent when the law is supposedly working as well. And the law constantly has to write itself as nonviolent in order for it to produce this sort of form of being able to adjudicate justice, and for them to then say when there's moments of failure. So this is what I've been trying to think about for quite some time. And it started at first when I was working in LA, an organization, and this is a legal organization, and there was a petition going around for organizations to sign on to critiques around crack cocaine sentencing. But the organization I was working for at the time felt that we couldn't sign this letter because we served victims only. And that was really hard for me, and I was really pissed, but at the time I didn't really know how to explain that. And this sort of formation around victim, which is a legal creation, right? And I think it has all its sort of forms outside of the law, but if we were to actually take the terms of the way the law produces this term of victim, it actually then puts forward also how the law relies on this pure idea of what innocence is. And Saira actually raised that as well, right? That the law's production of what it sees to be as nonviolent and what it sees to be as innocent requires it then to also create ideas of what is not innocent, and those are on racialized and gendered and sexualized terms. So I look at sort of this legal figure of the undocumented crime victim, and everybody here has pointed out sort of that paradigm and the contradictions within that paradigm. And the violence of that paradigm is that undocumented crime victims are on the one hand, already culpable for remaining within the nation state without legal status, but also have to also constantly prove their innocence in order to be seen as proper victims who are worthy of protection. And it's this shuttling between culpability and innocence where violence is produced, right? And that violence is produced because it's constantly marked as nonviolent. It's seen as a solution. But legal solutions within the immigration system are part of the violence of the immigration system as well. And so that's, I think, something that, if we think about too, even with sanctuary, like after the election, the Los Angeles police chief was right there on the news right away saying LAPD supports sanctuary. And LAPD has one of the largest histories of racial violence against Black communities and communities of color. But he goes on to say why he supports sanctuary. Right? He's like, we support sanctuary because we want immigrant communities to feel safe to be part of our policing efforts. And it's about turning immigrants into policing themselves, their own communities, as well as the communities of others. And so this sort of like framework also gets mapped onto certain forms of visa protections that fall within these undocumented crime victim paradigms. And I think that that is something that is not necessarily also only particular to this moment. It's part of this larger expansion. So a lot of the visa protections that are designed for survivors of gender and sexual violence emerged in the early 2000s. And even though people in the anti-violence movement are trying to push back against the requirements of cooperation, which are in order for you to qualify to apply for the visa, not that you would get it, just to qualify to fucking apply, you have to be able to prove that you are worthy and able to cooperate and willing, your will to cooperate. And so that sort of condition also is played out in these different kinds of pro-policing narratives around sanctuary. Yesterday, Stacey Suh brought a very different narrative around what sanctuary for all would look like. And I just really want to lift up what she said, as well as what other folks have brought up on this panel. That sort of difficulty in talking about abolition when it comes to immigrant rights is a part of the intersections of gender and sexual violence with the immigration legal system. It's not about trying to improve immigration so that we have less, so that we have more fair or more just forms of policing. It's actually about abolishing these terms of violence that naturalize and normalize and constantly reform the immigration system as potentially and even possibly nonviolent. And then lastly, everybody on the panel brought up sort of this language, I think, around when immigrant women try to use the legal system for forms of relief. And all of these conditions are all conditions that are already preempted by the legal system's construction of status as criminalization, right? So you're, even within this sort of system that's trying to provide forms of protection, it's protection around gender and sexual violence, but you're also needing protection from the state itself. So for immigrant women who are survivors, you only can say that you're a survivor of interpersonal violence. You never get to make a claim that you need to also be a survivor of state violence that is causing this whole condition to begin with. So that, I think, also then raises the need to think about immigration law and the politics around immigration within the larger sort of legacy of settler colonialism that forces us to think about forced citizenship as a form of violence as well, not just exclusion from citizenship. And how can we think about those things together? It's very difficult, but I really appreciate folks that are trying to do that work, not only in terms of like individual cases, but also in terms of building new kinds of conversations and building new relationships that are necessary when we don't always think that the law is going to provide the answer.
Some themes that I'm hearing and that I'm sort of struggling with as well is the first discussion narratives, right? So what kinds of narratives are strategic, what kinds of narratives are ethical, the ways in which people are pushed to articulate claims in terms of family, in terms of labor, right? In terms of roots, right? Property claims, like I put my labor in the soil, I've been here so long, it's unjust to rip me out, or contract, like as a kind of exchange for the labor I produced, I should be allowed to stay, or I deserve this protection. family claims, right? They're deserving because they have family and that family has particular status, or that family is vulnerable, right? What about people who don't have family? Claims about community, what about people who are not seen as having community ties, or their community participation renders them suspect? You know, they don't go to the church, they go to the mosque, right? There are all these ways in which, in individual cases, I think it's very difficult for people who are making claims for some kind of recognition or rights or redress not to do this move that everybody on the panel is saying is so problematic, which is recognize me and see me as different from this other group, right? So if we move to a position of all of us or none of us, of abolition, I guess my question for the panel is there no outer limit to that? Is there still a way in which there's still a border around who us is? And is that border those of us who are physically present within the nation state? Is there something about being territorially present that cabins the claims of who was allowed to be part of the we or the member that these claims are being articulated for? Right, so that's one question. Another question is, I think Leanne's comments really brought to the fore the question of what is called carceral feminism and ways in which gender appears not just as a way that people are made more vulnerable, but also a way that people try to, you know, there's a wedge, right, and as a way of getting redress. And how do people negotiate this, you know, in addition to the question of trafficking, you know, the rubric of trafficking and visa status, also the question of gender-based asylum and all the kinds of claims that are foundational to those cases. And then lastly, I was fascinated by this idea that Angie was raising around sanctuary for immigrants as being a kind of wedge. That if there's a moment where immigrants are not, you know, rapists and criminals and killing fields, but actually are seen as deserving of protection, is there a way to use that moment to push more things in it for other groups of people that are, you know, historically more denigrated? And so I think it's a really interesting question whether or not, when do we see that possibility? When do we make those moves? And is that move also then something that is politically susceptible to having limits, right, in terms of, you know, how, say, a city will define, right, who actually belongs and this kind of thing. So, anyways.
I wonder if you could expand on abolitionism. Would it not also require kind of, besides abolition towards kind of incarceration, when you need to abolish nation states?
I'm just going to address kind of the last question, something around there, just of like the limits of sanctuary and immigrants. And I mean, I will just acknowledge a lot of the work that we're doing is reformist in mind, right? It's not getting at necessarily abolition at the long term with some of the tweaks, because we're still working under the structural frame itself that's unjust. I mean, if we're still working on law enforcement, and I think that's where we're trying to take a step back of like, yes, we can look, I mean, this is one of the issues in the criminal justice reform too, is we keep tweaking these systems, but not looking at like, why are we not divesting altogether from the system? And at least in the immigrant rights movement, it's very hard. I'm part of very few conversations where we actually could articulate what an alternative world would look like. We actually, it's hard for us to envision that. Like, we do have these conversations like with no borders, but what would that actually mean? Like, you know, and how could we actually understand this concept of no citizenship at all? Like that there wouldn't be, you know, these different levels. So I think that's the hard thing to get to, and for us, it's been just even a hard thing to come to the intersectionality of some of this work at the local level. The final thing I would say, I guess, to your question, Leti, is just, I mean, there has been, unfortunately, a lot of conversation at the state level here where legislators are like, they are about a political agenda around immigration, and they don't really care about criminal justice as much. And it's incumbent upon us to make those links between, we've been asked many times to pass bills that said, no, we're not going to do this for this population, we only want a small immigration fix here. And it's just a fundamental ignorance of how these systems work and how they're going to continue to self-perpetuate itself by even just doing this one fix and having that. But I think it's for us important to come in there and have a broad-based coalition that does that education and kind of forces the conversation, or else we are not willing to actually move some of those reforms, even though we know that those reforms are still smaller minded and not really necessarily getting at like destroying this framework.
So to the question of boundaries, right, and are there boundaries? Right now the work that I'm doing is around Latino migrant lifers. And these are folks that, some of them have engaged in real violent harm towards people, right? And so that's one of the questions that comes up in my mind in the conversations that I'm having, right? Like some of these people have harmed, in some cases killed their own children, right? But, so I have a group of students that's working with me and we're looking through the transcripts of parole hearings for these folks, right? And reading their stories. And so it's been really transformative for the students and myself because what we keep seeing, of course, and as the panel has discussed, is those histories of violence, right? That are rooted in trauma, and so for me, that's where I go in terms of boundaries. These are folks that would, and the students came into the research, into this project, you know, these are people that did horrible things and they deserve what they get, right? And so for them to go through the transcripts, read people's stories, and then come to, no, this does not work, right? These are people that, of course we know that, people that have been harmed. And it's rooted in these longer histories of colonialism, of violence, structural violence. And so they themselves didn't start off abolitionist, now they're abolitionists because they went through that work and they've expanded. So for them, that there's no more boundary there, right? These are folks that also deserve to be part of our community, to pay attention to what they're going through. So narratives, I think, are really important in expanding how we think about this and actually getting people to build community beyond the boundaries that we start off with, right? So that's, I think, has been really productive for me to get to that point with it's like, well, no, we shouldn't have those boundaries.
Yeah, I just wanted to also address Leti's question and Andy's question. Andy, you were asking about whether or not abolish would also mean to abolish the nation state. And absolutely, like the prison system and the singular idea of the single nation state that can't be not separate, or they come together. And even particularly if you're thinking about immigration law, like if we think of immigration law as a form of law that manages within a single nation state, we're turning folks in the Pacific and folks who are on their own lands into, as Leti has argued, immigrants, right, rather than being indigenous to their own lands. And even thinking about like territorial borders and the different territories of the U.S. nation states, those are sites where this notion of who's indigenous can never be part of that conversation. It's constantly erased through the formations of immigration law and managing who can come on and off. But I also think too that trying to imagine as well as to put into practice some of the struggles that everyone in this panel has like brought forward, that it can't just be like, oh, we're going to abolish these forms, but it's also about reimagining, which would require that we imagine with no single nation state formation at all. And I really truly believe in that, and I almost like need that in order to move forward. It also, I think, too, brings up other questions of terms that we like hold on to. Even these notions of like good and bad citizens, or who's a fraudulent citizen and who's not a fraudulent citizen, all of those frameworks still constantly naturalize the single nation state frame. Even choosing between those things, but if we were to maybe take one up, and if we were to embrace one of those frames, would that actually allow us to then move away from having to choose? And that's one of the things I've been trying to think a little bit more about, is like, what would something like embracing fraud allow us to open forward, and would that allow us to get away from reinforcing single nation state frames and not always being cognizant of how that is constantly erasing indigenous folks? So I don't know, Andy, if that's what you, but that's what is, that to me is like at the deep part of all this. And I was thinking, Angie, about what you were saying about like, you know, these are things that we have to like ask for, like you were talking about the work, like these, it's like there isn't a choice but to have to also like constantly like strategize around fixes. And like with the temporary relief, for survivors of violence. Those forms were originally created to better the police state, right? So all of these forms were created under the Violence Against Women's Act and sort of narrated as rescuing women from their own communities. But what's fucked up about that is that they were actually designed to better and support local police forms and services. And this requirement for cooperation within VAWA, it's only immigrant women that are required to cooperate within VAWA provisions that are outlined so carefully and so clearly in that sort of framework. And what if we were to say no cooperation, right? No cooperation, but in the way we talk about what that would look like, we try to put that within a feminist and abolitionist framework. And that's something I'm really hoping in. And hearing yesterday and today, I feel like that's, I'm just gonna stop there, so.